The task that we were assigned involved understanding and challenging the concepts of the periphery and the right to the city. Our plan was to use intervention art as research and experience in translating theory into urban socio-material space. Many questions came to mind, such as, what is it that we address with the concept of periphery? And what does it mean to live on the edge of the city or the society? And where do we find such peripheral spaces and people living in conditions of marginalisation? What do these places look like? And who is living there? Do they exist in Munich? What rights do people living in such situations or spaces have, and what do they lack? How can they claim their right to the city, and what is such this right to the city? Where do we stand as architects within this field of periphery and the right to the city? The following is a documentation of our interventions.
We started to look for a physical periphery by looking on the map to the edge of the city, and we found different areas of the town that were recognizable as peri-urban interface. As Adriana Lean defines them, area where it's hard to find boundaries between the country and the city. We all agreed on the fact that periphery is usually disconnected from the main infrastructures, doesn't have a strong center, and present a building typology of high-density buildings. These buildings are usually built with poor material as concrete and don't have a strong identity inside the district because of their standard repetition. Observing the map, finding these neighborhoods was not difficult. In fact, they were recognizable by the repetition of the types of buildings that generally present a rectangular shape repeated on a modular grid, which reflects a large-scale design typical of low-cost projects. In our international group, we had even 2 persons from Munich that confirmed what the rumors were saying. Finally, we decided to visit Hasenbergl ourselves to verify or dismiss the rumors that we had heard.
By further investigating the place, we interpreted a lack of interaction and communication between different social groups and the different divided areas of the public space. We thought there was an absence of a common ground or a stimulus for people of different groups to meet and interact with each other. This interpretation led us to think about several interventions. This division of the public space prompted us to assume that there was a lack of a real center in this area of the city. By this we mean that we felt an absence of a common ground for all the inhabitants of the area. We rather sensed a patchwork of smaller centers, but without any interconnection. Some of the public spaces are accessible by all public, while others are intended as a public space for a more selective group. This is made clear by signs, vegetation and use. We could read a certain degree of appropriation of the public space to serve certain needs of the inhabitants. With this degree of appropriation, also the degree of social control increases.
The story obviously is not just any story, it's a story about periphery, center relationships. Think of the texts. Well, what is the power and who takes the decisions in the Galtung text? Or
the word of Flohtausch comes from the German word Flohmarkt and Tausch. The former one means flea market and the latter one suggests the property of the word exchange. So Flohtausch is an exchange activity that takes place as a flea market. This idea came up when we were having the discussion of periphery and center. According to people's first impression, Hasenbergl as one of the peripheries of Munich is excluded from the center of life. This community has just the function of a dormitory. By day, inhabitants go to the city and work. By night, they return to their community and close themselves in their houses and sleep. This was also our idea before we arrived at Hasenbergl and saw it with our own eyes. We found some abandoned furniture pieces during our interview section in the neighborhood. So we thought that we could put in use these furniture pieces in our setting of the scene for the Flohtausch. During the afternoon session, a very interesting thing happened. A man who brought us an object recognized another object which belongs to another woman, and this man told us that the object was a gift to his daughter, so the woman must be his daughter. People sometimes can recognize other people via objects and memories, and this was also a good way for people to exchange. The object itself has more meaning than conversation sometimes.
The tic-tac-toe concept evolved from several ideas, the use of fallen leaves in the depressingly vacant space between Hasenbergl and Feldmocking. The idea to create something from the leaves that would distract people passing by and to create an intervention into the everyday lives of the locals. The game of tic-tac-toe itself is quite simple, but the symbology goes far beyond simple noughts and crosses. For the local residents to play the game in the space allows them to label that space with an X and to capture that space as their own. The vacant space in which we held the intervention was once upon a time planned to be a freeway, but for one reason or another the freeway was never built, which left the area with little other than high voltage transmission lines and a children's playground. We collected the leaves from the surrounding area, raking up several large bags full of autumn colours. The tic-tac-toe grid was roughly 20 metres by 20 metres in size, and the grid lines were roughly a foot wide. It could be seen from 50 metres away easily, from ground level, and from 100 metres away from the first story of the surrounding buildings. One lady walked down from her apartment and asked us what we were doing, and once we explained what we were up to, she went back home and came back with her 3 children to play with us, which was completely our intention for people to be inquisitive and explore the place that we had created in the space. The signs intervention was intended to arouse a response from the locals, whether or not they felt that the vacant space between Hasenbergl and Feldmocking had created a barrier, both socially and or spatially. We put up a sign at each side of the grassy plain, saying that you were entering or leaving Hasenbergl and Feldmocking respectively. After interviewing some of the locals after they walked past the signs, we discovered a few different responses. Some people thought that there was no humour in the signs, whilst others found them funny. However, most people agreed that there was no barrier, and that if Hasenbergl has a reputation, then Feldmocking also shares that reputation. The interventions were an interesting attempt to bring into practice theoretical texts and to discover and observe periphery in a specific place. The main finding from the interventions was that, by closely observing the place during the interventions, knowledge about the area could be gathered. Whilst our interventions were short-term, our goal was never meant to make big changes, but rather to find out something more about the place. In the end, Hasenbergl was not the least desired place to live in Munich, as we have heard from locals as well as internet forums. From speaking to the locals, we found that most of them chose to live in Hasenbergl and did not think that it was a periphery. Interventions are a highly useful tool to study an area, and we learnt many things about peripheral areas and what constitutes a periphery, so that we may in the future, as architects and planners, avoid building peripheral spaces.